this week's episode with a stirring rendition of La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. Written in response to the Austro-Prussian invasion of France in 1792, the song's lyrics give a blood-curdling account of the threat posed by the invading army and call for an all-out effort from the French to defend their homeland. With every step of the enemy's approach to the capital, the crisis grew more pressing, and with a major engagement looming at Valmy, an orgy of violence known as the September Massacres erupted in Paris. Over the course of 4 consecutive nights, some 1,200 suspected counter-revolutionaries, many of whom were in fact innocent visitors to the city, were subjected to makeshift tribunals and summary executions. Though reminiscent in a way of the widespread purge of Tories during the American Revolution, the French version was far bloodier. Meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte, then a student at the National Military School in Paris, reacted to the violence of the times with what might best be described as opportunistic ambivalence, revealing a willingness to use the revolution to his advantage, while dismissing it as the mistress of the hour, a deep but inevitably fleeting passion. Indeed, for much of his ensuing career, he would seek to curb the excesses of the revolution, while at the same time presenting himself as its champion and inheritor. We turn now to the text of Quest for Empire, and an account of the tumultuous period from the outset of Napoleon's military training to his dizzying promotion to Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior. The notion that hereditary kings were anointed of God and subject to no earthly authority beyond themselves, a principle espoused by King James I of England at the outset of the 17th century, was an idea that seemed to beget its own demise. While it may have served to bolster James's authoritarian resolve as a newcomer to the English throne, there is little evidence to suggest that it made his job any easier, and by mid-century the theory would be categorically disproved when Parliament summarily beheaded his son and heir, Charles I. In France, meanwhile, the divine right theory would live on, attaining its fullest flowering during the reign of Louis XIV, aptly known as the Sun King for the glory of his reign. His radiance would begin to fade, however, under his son Louis XV, whose mistress, Madame Pompadour, is thought to have been responsible for the utterance, "Après nous le déluge," after us destruction, a saying widely interpreted as a portent of the revolutionary violence to come. In any case, by the time Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, the Sun King's legacy had become decidedly less sunny, and the idea that kings enjoyed divinely sanctioned authority had succumbed to changing interpretations of the role, if not the relevance, of monarchs. Compounding the problems associated with its increasingly antiquated system of government, France under Louis XVI had amassed enormous debts as a result of the country's participation in the American Revolution, the burden of which inevitably fell on the middle and lower classes, known as the Third Estate, in the form of increased taxes and fees. According to long tradition, the French clergy paid few taxes of any kind, while the nobility enjoyed various exemptions based on rank. Now, in the face of a mounting financial crisis, both upper classes, or estates, clung to their privileges, while the overburdened commoners made increasingly strident demands for reform. Such was the magnitude of the problem that in May 1789, amid growing popular unrest, the king was compelled to convene the Estates General, a representative body that had not met in over 150 years. Even so, the royal concession was little more than an empty gesture, for although the Third Estate represented by far the largest segment of the population, as much as 96% by some estimates, various procedural rules worked to keep the Estates General firmly under the control of the upper classes. Yet neither the king nor the privileged few had anticipated the new strength and assertiveness of the French middle class. When faced with the prospect of being outvoted, the people's representatives broke with tradition and declared themselves a new National Assembly with broad powers. The king responded by denying the rebellious representatives access to their appointed meeting rooms, whereupon they moved to a nearby building in which a tennis court served them as an auditorium. Here, amid much excitement, they took an oath not to disband until they had formulated a new constitution. Known as the Tennis Court Oath, the agreement posed a serious challenge to the old order, and when substantial numbers of the two upper estates joined the renegade movement, the authority of the French monarchy was suddenly called into question. Confronted with the popular revolt, the king relented, eventually agreeing to the formation of a new legislative body. But by this time events were moving beyond his control. When rumors began circulating that he was secretly gathering troops with which to restore order, mob violence broke out on the streets of the capital. The crisis came to a head on the 14th of July, 1789, when, following 2 days of rioting, a large mass of armed citizens surrounded the Bastille, a stone fortress symbolic of royal authority, demanding that its stores of weapons and ammunition be turned over to the people. When these demands went unmet, 2 members of the mob managed to climb an exterior wall and lower a drawbridge, at which point the mob surged forward into an outer courtyard, where royalist defenders of the fortress fired down on the insurgents from its walls, killing as many as 100. Next, 2 detachments of French guards arrived in support of the people, positioning several heavy guns in front of the main gate. A lull in the firing ensued, and seeking to prevent further bloodshed, the governor of the Bastille agreed to capitulate. A second drawbridge was lowered to allow the mob into an inner courtyard, and for a moment it seemed the incident was over, as the leaders of the mob embraced the soldiers of the garrison in a spirit of reconciliation. When isolated shots were fired from the parapet by those unaware of the surrender, however, the mob went on a murderous rampage, killing the entire garrison as well as many suspected royalists, and dragging their dismembered bodies through the streets. While the Bastille was of little strategic significance, the fall of the royal fortress and the unprecedented orgy of violence that attended it would prove a decisive turning point, suddenly giving new life to long-suppressed dreams of democratic reforms. At the same time, the success of the mob inspired fears of reprisal and a heightened sense of urgency about the need to secure constitutional protections for the people. Thus the event created a dynamism of its own. In response, the king alternated between indulgent leniency and reactionary repression, eventually making one concession after another in hopes of retaining some measure of control. But it was a forlorn hope at best. Though the new National Assembly would be comprised of members of all 3 estates, it was now the commoners who held sway through a faction known as the Girondins, so called for their identification with the Gironde region in the southwest of the country. Known for their high-flown oratory, the Girondins favored the creation of a constitutional monarchy in which the king would continue to reign, albeit in a circumscribed capacity. This position would soon be challenged by the growing influence of more radical elements among the political societies of Paris, chief among them the Jacobin Club, named for its proximity to the Church of Saint-Jacques in the city's Latin Quarter. Enjoying wide support among the lower classes in particular, the radical Jacobins would insist on the creation of a republic in which the king would play no part whatsoever. And with the Paris mob acting as its de facto army, the radical faction would eventually triumph. Indeed, by the spring of 1791, the pervasive threat of mob violence had rendered the king a virtual prisoner in the Tuileries Palace at the center of the city, where he remained in fear of his life. In June, belatedly taking matters into his own hands, he and the royal family attempted to escape the growing chaos, dressing as ordinary citizens and making a dash for German territory in an inconspicuous carriage. Recognized and arrested at the village of Varennes, some 50 miles short of freedom, the family was brought back to Paris in disgrace, their prospects having grown bleaker than ever. Thus far the king, if only to appear solicitous of the well-being of his subjects, had been receptive to many of the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, naively supposing that they could somehow be reconciled with the precepts of monarchy. But now his true attitude toward the revolution stood revealed. and news of his predicament would compel the other monarchies of Europe to prepare for war against the nascent French Republic. Thus, Louis became a pawn in a larger struggle to prevent the spread of revolution, which in turn incited the radicals in Paris to accelerate their efforts to overthrow him and prevent the possibility of his ever being restored to power. Meanwhile, as a student in military school in Paris, Napoleon would inevitably be swept up in the turbulence of the times. During the early years of the revolution, he would enjoy 3 lengthy leaves of absence to Corsica, each time involving himself in the volatile politics of his homeland to a greater and more perilous extent. The first of these visits began in September of 1789, a mere 2 months after the fall of the Bastille, at which point, with the capital still reeling from sporadic violence, he quickly threw his support behind an emerging Corsican independence movement, a move that seriously compromised his position as an aspiring French officer. Under other circumstances, such conduct might have led to charges of treason, but in the confusion wrought by recent events in Paris, his actions went largely unnoticed by officialdom. His fellow Corsicans, however, were decidedly less forgiving. A clear majority wanted no part of his peremptory efforts to seize control of the island, and before long he was unable to walk the streets of his hometown, Ajaccio, without fear of attack from those opposed to his plans. After a year and a half of agitating for a cause few supported, he succeeded only in damaging his reputation among both his fellow islanders and his army superiors, whose good graces he further offended by overstaying the term of his leave by several weeks. Still, he was not prepared to give up the fight. Finally returning to Auxonne in February 1791, he was soon transferred with his regiment to Valence, where he set about lobbying for yet another leave with plans to return to his homeland. Indeed, a mere 6 months after the end of his previous leave, he was able to return to Ajaccio in time to visit his family's chief benefactor, Archdeacon Lucien, shortly before the latter's death. While Napoleon took some comfort in seeing the family provided for in the dying man's will, this new sense of security only spurred his desire to take part in Corsica's fractious politics, and soon he was back in the middle of the fray again. By this time, in an effort to placate the warring factions, the revolutionary government in Paris had reached out to Pasquale Paoli, offering the former exile the position of president of the Department of Corsica, a move that at once disenfranchised local firebrands, Napoleon among them, and incorporated Paoli's potent legend within the larger framework of the French Revolution. This obliged Napoleon to apply to Paoli for the coveted post of commander of the island's National Guard forces, a request that was turned down flat. Aware of the young man's recent agitation on behalf of independence, and of his own tenuous position as a newly instated French official, Paoli wanted nothing to do with him. Bitterly disappointed, Napoleon responded by arranging to get himself elected second in command of a volunteer militia unit in Ajaccio and mounting an attack on the local French garrison. For a nominal member of the French army, this was hardly a wise career move, and to make matters worse, he had once again overstayed his leave, this time by 4 months, long enough to compel his regiment to find a replacement. Facing deep trouble with the authorities in Paris, he now raced to the capital to defend his actions. Exactly what Napoleon said in his own defense on this occasion is a matter of historical speculation. In any case, his argument proved effective, aided in large measure by the convulsive politics of the times. With the country continuing to come apart at its feudal seams, Napoleon's gaffe in distant Corsica was deemed of little importance, and far from being prosecuted, he was promoted to captain on condition that he remain in Paris. It was during this period that he witnessed the mob's advance on the Tuileries on the 20th of June, 1792, in which the king was compelled to wear a Jacobin bonnet and drink wine with a drunken rabble. Later, on the 10th of August, Napoleon was again present during the full-scale attack in which some 600 members of the king's Swiss Guard were massacred in the palace courtyard. Though disgusted by these increasingly violent signs of incipient chaos, the young officer was in no position to do anything about them. Revolution was the mistress of the hour, as he characterized the situation to his former roommate, Desmaisons. And a month later the cannonade at Valmy would give further impetus to its progress. At this point, the king had only 5 more months to live. Even the intensity of life in the capital could not distract Napoleon from his fixation with Corsica, however, and a month later, October 1792, under the pretext of escorting his sister Elissa home from school, he arranged to return once again to Ajaccio. That he was able to win approval on such grounds would lead some to suspect that he was sent by government officials for the purpose of spying on Pasquale Paoli, whose loyalty to the revolutionary regime was in question. In any case, upon his arrival, he met with Paoli to request command of National Guard forces in a Paris-inspired plan to invade nearby Sardinia, then at war with France. Though Paoli did not favor the plan, and continued to harbor the deepest reservations about Napoleon, he reluctantly agreed to a scheme in which the young officer would join some 800 National Guardsmen on a mission to seize an island off the coast in preparation for a larger assault on Sardinia proper. The expedition no sooner made a successful landing, however, than the commander, citing a mutiny among the sailors, ordered an abrupt return to Corsica, nearly leaving Napoleon behind in his haste. Though furious at the mission's failure, Napoleon would remain largely unsuspecting of any subterfuge, despite later evidence suggesting that Paoli had orchestrated the entire incident in order to discredit him. Having once again run afoul of Corsica's labyrinthine politics, Napoleon hatched yet another scheme to seize power by force. Removing his mother and siblings to a safe place elsewhere on the island, he mounted his own sea-borne attack on Ajaccio, in hopes that a sizable pro-French faction would rally to his cause. The town held out against him, however, responding to his ill-conceived attempt at a takeover by officially condemning him and seizing his family home. Bitterly disillusioned, he had little choice but to arrange passage to the mainland for his family and flee to Toulon, his efforts to play a leadership role in his homeland having come to an end. Indeed, for all of his future success throughout the continent, Corsica would remain one of the few places Napoleon was unable to conquer. From the time of Napoleon's departure for Corsica in October 1792 until his return in June 1793, much had happened in his adoptive country. In the aftermath of their success at Valmy, French forces had advanced eastward to the Rhine, establishing the country's long-sought natural frontiers, and giving the revolution new credibility in the eyes of Europe. At the same time, the Jacobins had come to dominate the National Convention, as the former National Assembly was now called, prevailing over the Girondins on the critical issue of the fate of the king. In January 1793, Louis XVI met his death on the guillotine, at which point there could be no turning back. With the king's execution, the new French Republic was irrevocably bound on a largely uncharted course toward popular democracy. In the absence of a unitary executive, however, all constitutional authority resided with the convention, where the reputations of influential legislators would rise and fall in a gathering storm of political infighting. One such legislator was Jean-Paul Marat, a largely self-made scientist and doctor who in 1789 abandoned both pursuits in order to publish a series of incendiary newspapers in which he accused a long list of public figures of betraying the cause of liberty. Driven into hiding by official reaction to his slanders, he spent much of the years 1791-92 living literally underground in the Paris sewers, where he kept up his relentless diatribes in print despite contracting a disfiguring skin disease. Indeed, the hardships of his life underground enhanced his reputation as a firebrand among the revolutionaries of Paris, eventually leading to his election to the National Convention. His rise to power would be clouded by allegations of involvement in the recent September massacres, however, for which he was placed on trial in April 1793. Even so, the court proceedings only increased his fame and popularity among the people. ultimately acquitted, he would be carried through the streets of the capital in triumph. Not all French citizens shared the enthusiasm of the Paris mob, however, and on the evening of the 13th of July, 1793, a well-dressed, attractive young woman arrived at Marat's lodgings and asked to speak with him. She had visited the same neighborhood earlier that day with the same request and been turned away by locals suspicious of her motives. On the second try, however, she reached the door of his apartments and explained to a housekeeper that she brought news of events in the countryside. The exchange was overheard by Marat in the next room, where he was soaking in a bathtub, a daily treatment for his skin condition, during which he often received visitors. Dismissing the housekeeper's initial reservations, he called for the stranger to be shown in. The young woman entered and showed him a list of purported Girondin sympathizers in her district. The two were interrupted briefly by Marat's common-law wife, who received assurances that all was well and left to fetch more water for his bath. Then, while the controversial journalist was busy copying down the names, the young woman drew a 6-inch knife from the folds of her dress and struck him a single blow to the chest. Awash in the warm bath, her victim bled out and died in a matter of moments. The murderous young woman was one Charlotte Corday. 24 years old, she had traveled to the capital from Normandy, where her father was a member of the lesser nobility, whose prospects had diminished considerably since the Revolution. Charlotte, meanwhile, had been living in Caen with a wealthy relative, whose fortune she stood to inherit. Unlike the rest of her family, however, she harbored no royalist sentiments. Schooled at a local convent, she had been inspired by the writings of Voltaire and Rousseau, and more particularly by the high-flown oratory of the now eclipsed Girondins, several of whose leaders she had met during speaking tours in Caen. These same leaders would be publicly reviled and calumniated by Marat, a man she was convinced was bringing about the ruin of the country. "I knew that he was perverting France," she explained during her trial. "I killed one man to save 100,000. Sentenced to death on the guillotine, she would confront her fate, according to one newspaper account, with imperturbable calm. Like Joan of Arc, she seemed possessed of a messianic resolve, and like Joan, she would go to her death a maid. In the end, however, the martyrdom she sought would fail of its purpose, for her bloody act would only serve to advance the cause of her enemies, lending credence to Marat's many warnings of counter-revolutionary plots, and thereby helping instigate a dark period to be known as the Reign of Terror. It was against this backdrop that the Bonapartes took up residence in Toulon, now more dependent than ever on Napoleon, whose fortunes were in turn the more closely linked to those of the French Republic. Happily for all parties, despite his recent debacle in Corsica and extended leaves of absence, Napoleon was welcomed back without incident to his old regiment, which was then stationed in Nice, another of the border regions recently won by French troops. His return was timely, for the regiment would soon be engaged in a mission that would solidify the Republic's military gains and propel Napoleon onto the national stage. As the assassination of Marat would suggest, the rise of the radical Jacobins had been accompanied by growing disenchantment with the revolution in many parts of the country, especially the south, where resistance to Parisian authority, be it Bourbon or Republican, had a long history. So it was that when repressive new measures were passed in May and June of 1793, the cities of Marseilles and Avignon rose up in revolt. The Paris regime responded by assembling some 3,000 men at Valence under the command of Jean-François Carteau, a former painter and policeman with no military training whatsoever. Marching first on Avignon, the hastily assembled Republican army defeated a force of counter-revolutionaries in a desultory action on the 24th of July, and within a month Marseille capitulated. Having witnessed some of the fighting, Napoleon was thoroughly disgusted with Carteau's tactics as well as the political cleansing that followed. In a scene that would be repeated again and again in the coming months, the arrival of Republican forces had been accompanied by the appearance of a guillotine in the public square. Even if such operations were not the sort of military glory Napoleon imagined for himself, however, he clearly saw in the royalist uprisings an opportunity to advance his career, and it was during this period that he undertook to write a propaganda leaflet in support of the Republican regime. Titled "The Supper at Beaucer," it detailed a dinner conversation between a young army officer, himself, and a small gathering of citizens of various occupations in a village along the coast. In the course of the conversation, the officer makes an impassioned plea for the Republican cause, and castigates those who would foment civil war, eventually winning his dinner companions over to his point of view. The article was circulated freely, and brought Napoleon's name to the attention of a number of political officials, providing assurance of its author's political loyalty at a time when such assurance would prove highly advantageous to his career. Meanwhile, the crisis in the Midi was by no means over. Within days of the surrender of Marseilles, royalists in nearby Toulon invited an Anglo-Spanish fleet under Lord Hood to enter the harbor and take charge of the city's defenses. Home to the French Mediterranean fleet and its arsenal, Toulon was strategically vital, and its capture by the enemy represented the most serious threat to the Republic since the Austro-Prussian invasion of the previous year. The nearest forces with which to respond were those of General Carteau, who was ordered to the scene from Marseilles. Meanwhile, General Lapoip, commanding the army of Italy, approached Toulon from the vicinity of Nice. Complicating the situation, the heights of Mount Ferron would effectively keep the two armies from combining forces, forcing them to establish separate headquarters and operate for the most part independently of each other. This left the lion's share of the tactical challenge to the inexperienced Carteau, who managed to seize the outlying town of Ollioules, but not without the loss of his chief artillery officer, who was seriously wounded in the process. As fate would have it, Napoleon arrived on the scene shortly thereafter, escorting a supply of gunpowder bound for the army of Italy. Stopping at Carteau's headquarters, he called on an old acquaintance from Corsica, Cristoforo Salicetti, who was even then engaged in efforts to find a replacement for the unit's former artillery officer. Given the scope of the career it was to launch, the encounter was indeed fortunate, an observation Salicetti sensed at once. Quickly appointing Napoleon to the vacant post, he would write to officials in Paris, "Fate has sent us a miracle." Likewise, it was the break Napoleon had been waiting for, and with his mother and siblings now safely removed to Marseilles, he lost no time in making the most of it. As for his friendship with Salicetti, it would prove something of a miracle in return, for his old acquaintance was now a representative of the National Convention, with direct ties to the all-powerful Committee of Public Safety. Even so, the recapture of Toulon would be no easy task, its logistical challenges compounded by the manifest ineptness of Carteau. From the first, Napoleon was convinced that the key to the position lay in control of two enemy-held forts on a promontory that jutted into Toulon's twin harbors from the west. Take these forts, he insisted, and the enemy fleet must either evacuate or be destroyed at its anchorage. By the time Carteau got around to ordering an assault, however, the enemy, alerted to his intentions, had reinforced the position with an additional redoubt, Fort Mulgrave, situated on an all but impregnable hilltop. At this point, both sides settled in for a prolonged siege, during which Napoleon grew increasingly frustrated. Forced to defer to a political appointee with little understanding of military affairs, he took to referring to Carteau as King Log. The object of his scorn, meanwhile, responded in kind, calling his new artillery officer Captain Cannon and the Greenhorn. Mutual enmity between the two persisted until the middle of November, when Jacques de Gommières arrived in Toulon to replace Carteau as field commander. A soldier of proven ability, de Gommières favored a more aggressive approach to the siege and quickly approved a plan conceived by Napoleon to seize Fort Mulgrave, from which French guns would be able to sweep the enemy fleet. Preparations were undertaken for an attack in which de Gommières' main force would lead the way, followed by a reserve under Captain Bonaparte, who by this time had assembled over 100 guns from forts throughout the coastal region, ringing the harbor with a series of batteries from which he could deliver a deadly crossfire. though one of these batteries was captured and its guns disabled in a surprise Allied raid, a Republican counter-raid led by Napoleon not only succeeded in recapturing the lost position, but swept onward to take a key redoubt overlooking the northern end of the bay, capturing the English commander, General O'Hara, in the process. In addition to his technical expertise, the young artillery commander, it seemed, was also an inspired leader of men. Its flank now protected, the French attack on Fort Mulgrave went forward despite heavy rains on the night of the 16th of December. Advancing under cover of darkness, the attackers drove the enemy from a pair of outlying redoubts and proceeded to storm the main walls of the enemy's formidable defenses. Several attempts to scale the walls were turned back, however, and as the main assault began to lose momentum, the reserve force was ordered to advance in support. Once again showing a remarkable ability to lead by personal example, Napoleon rushed over a palisade and through a series of narrow gun ports in the main wall, receiving a wound in a sharp hand-to-hand fight with enemy cannoneers. Meanwhile, his men had been right behind him, and inspired to fresh effort by the bold action of the reserve, the main force went forward again with a will. By dawn, Fort Mulgrave was in French hands, and as Napoleon had predicted, the capture of the fort proved decisive. The next day, masses of enemy troops, as well as a good many royalist sympathizers, could be seen crowding aboard the Allied ships, preparing to abandon Toulon. For his role in the victory, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general and placed in command of all French coastal defenses between Marseilles and Nice. Given the volatile politics of the times, however, notoriety and success could quickly turn to disgrace and prosecution. With conspirators, real and imagined, scheming to destroy the Republic and restore Bourbon rule, the leaders of the National Convention in Paris had begun a ruthless campaign to suppress any and all resistance. By this time the triumph of the Jacobins had brought to power a former country lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, whose rise to leadership of the grotesquely misnamed Committee of Public Safety would mark the beginning of the Reign of Terror. In speeches full of high-minded moralizing and tacit threats, Robespierre made it clear that no one was safe from summary judgment and death. Not even the great hero of the Republic, Georges Danton, would escape Robespierre's vengeance. Born into peasantry on a farm in the Champagne region, Danton had studied law and risen to prominence in the Convention, employing a Rabelaisian wit that celebrated the life of the common man in all of its earthiness. Robespierre, by contrast, was a lifelong bachelor whose fastidious appearance and prudish manner belied a hidden ruthlessness that would end up sending Danton to the guillotine for reasons having more to do with his red-blooded lifestyle than anything else. With the Convention's ruling committee firmly under his influence, Robespierre gave free rein to his own paranoid fears, orchestrating a series of political purges in which all recourse for accused persons was conveniently ignored. Unencumbered by legal constraints, the committee proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency to send as many as 60 people a day to the guillotine, until the streets of the capital ran with blood and reeked with the stench of a slaughterhouse. Nor was the country at large spared the hard hand of terror, as loyal Jacobins of the Convention, who crossed its ruling committee at risk of their own lives, spread its ruthless practices throughout the countryside. Known as representatives on mission, they would be responsible for implementing a remarkably forthright program of wholesale executions specified in an edict of the 5th of September, 1793, which read, "It is time that equality bore its scythe above all heads. It is time to horrify all the conspirators. So, legislators, place terror on the order of the day. Let us be in revolution, because everywhere counter-revolution is being woven by our enemies. The blade of the law should hover over all the guilty." The blade referred to, of course, was no mere figure of speech, but a real device of wood and steel, which took the human element out of executions, making them more efficient and relatively painless. As to its being reserved for the guilty, such would hardly be the case, as the people's representatives set about rounding up thousands of their fellow countrymen under the flimsiest of charges, parading them before ad hoc tribunals, and delivering them to the killing machines. in many cases all in the course of a single day. When it came to large numbers of suspects, in some cases whole villages or neighborhoods, the guillotine would scarcely suffice, and the committee's executioners were obliged to come up with new and innovative means of wholesale murder. In some instances, masses of hapless victims were simply tied together and herded onto rafts, which were then towed out into open water and sunk. An even grislier method involved standing such groups up in front of cannon and blasting them to pieces with grape shot. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped such capricious justice on 2 occasions. In the first instance, accusations centered on his efforts to fortify Marseilles against another takeover by the townspeople, as in Toulon. In an official report he had written of his intentions to position his guns in order to curb the town, a phrase that was quickly seized upon by the region's representative in Paris and cited as evidence of an attempt to rebuild the Bastilles put up by Louis XIV in order to tyrannize the South. The charges were eventually dropped with the help of Napoleon's friends in Paris, but not before he was obliged to spend several anxious days under house arrest. Shortly thereafter, the young general was deemed sufficiently trustworthy to be sent to Genoa on a secret mission of military surveillance. But during his absence, the events of 9 Thermidor sent Robespierre himself to the guillotine. Even the death of the dictator was fraught with peril, however, for upon his return from Genoa, Napoleon fell victim to a political backlash in which he was accused of plotting with the Genoese against the interests of France. Arrested and imprisoned at Antibes for 2 weeks, he was eventually cleared of suspicion, but his connection to the discredited regime would do residual damage to his career, leading to his effective demotion to an infantry rather than an artillery command. For a soldier of his training and experience, this latest development was devastating. Artillery was Napoleon's area of expertise, and the move meant the loss of much professional advantage and esteem. To make matters worse, he was assigned to the Army of the West, where he would be obliged to fight French rebels in the notorious Vendée, engaging in a guerrilla-style warfare which he found morally repugnant. Resisting the move as long as possible, he requested and received another leave, and awaited better fortune amid the diversions of the capital. There was no escaping his deep disappointment, however. From one of the Republic's most promising young officers, it seemed he had slipped back into obscurity, and with little hope of redeeming himself, he grew determined to join the long list of fellow officers who had left the country to pursue their military careers in the service of foreign powers. After careful consideration, he settled on Turkey, where the opportunity offered to help the Ottoman Empire resist the expansion of both Russia and England. His mind made up, he was in Paris awaiting the chance to take ship when a new constitution won approval in a national plebiscite, igniting another spate of mob violence. At issue was the empowerment of a 7-member executive panel, later reduced to 5, to be known as the Directory, and the continuance of fully 2/3 of the old convention as members of a new legislative assembly. Suddenly, with the capital once again in turmoil, Napoleon was presented with yet another opportunity. While attending a political speech, he met with Paul Barras, the newly appointed commander of the army, and with due urgency Barras asked Napoleon to serve under him. At stake was the future of the Republic, as even then insurgents with the backing of the National Guard were moving to seize control. Napoleon requested command of the army's artillery forces and was readily accepted. With no time to lose, the newly reinstated brigadier scrambled to assemble every available gun and took up a position in the vicinity of the Tuileries. The next day, 13 Vendémiaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, the 5th of October, 1795, the insurgents attacked about mid-afternoon. A crescendo of small arms fire announced their advance upon the palace, and when they appeared in front of Napoleon's battery, massing in greatest numbers on the steps of the church of Saint-Roch, he gave the order to fire. With a deafening roar, multiple rounds of grape shot, comprised of hundreds of individual projectiles, struck the advancing crowd with a sudden fury of destruction, killing hundreds of insurgents. The survivors responded with a welter of musketry, but there was no disputing the firepower of Napoleon's 12-pounders. Minutes later, with bodies littering the steps of the church and the surrounding streets, the attackers fell back and dispersed, hopelessly outgunned. The incident would prove a decisive turning point. Suddenly, the royalist counter-rebellion was ended, and with its demise, Napoleon's devotion to the Republican cause was re-established. Indeed, some 2 weeks later, Paul Barras was named to a seat on the Directory, and chosen to succeed him in army command was the man who had been instrumental in his advancement, General Bonaparte. Having only a short while earlier made up his mind to leave the country, Napoleon, aged 26, was now commander-in-chief of the Army of the Interior. Once again his star was on the ascendant, and for much of the next 2 decades it was to grow ever brighter.
Amour sacré de la